And welcome back to the Bullfish Hole podcast. Today, I have with me sociologist Bradley Campbell, and we're going to be talking about his book, How to Think Better About Social Justice, Why Good Sociology Matters. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Brad.
Thanks for having me.
So you've written before about some of the downsides of what you call victimhood culture and how this culture is taking over the universities. And I think that some of our Twitter mutuals or ex-mutuals, whatever you want to call them nowadays, would be surprised that you're writing a book on how to think better about social justice instead of a book arguing that we need to knock off all this social justice talk. Isn't social justice just victimhood culture? Or do you think the social justice warriors are onto something?
Okay, so in a way, I make distinctions in the book between doing sociology as a science or social science more broadly and what we can learn as a science and the pursuit of social justice. So those aren't the same thing. So in one sense, in some contexts, we would want to knock off pursuing social justice, right? That's not going to be the main aim of a university, most of a social science class, in my view, right? Or of the work we do and so on. We want to learn about the world. But if we're going to pursue social justice, if we're going to try to make the world a better place, whether it's trying to act morally in our own lives or trying to make the world a more moral or more prosperous, better place, better in any sense, then we want to know about the world. And to know about the world, we need social science. So that's the connection. Now, in terms of social justice, so some people won't like the term, and I don't think that we need to reject the term. So it's actually a distinction that we made in the Rise of Victimhood Culture book briefly as well. Kind of the point was we can talk about often social justice is used to mean a critical theory kind of informed perspective on social change and social activism. And that corresponds a lot with what we talked about as victimhood culture, where people are seeing the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed, and one gains status by being designated as a victim of oppression or an ally of the victims of oppression and so on. But that's one conception of social justice. And even though these things are often used synonymously, I don't think that the term, we could call it something else. You can come up with another name for trying to alter the institutions of society so that things are better. But people have been using the term social justice for something like that for hundreds of years. And I think critical theory is something much newer. So, I mean, and it's not that other conceptions of social justice haven't had their own problems. My thought is that we want to think of social justice, and this is something that we presented a bit in Rise of Victimhood Culture. So we've talked about this before, but I think a lot of people who use the term social justice use it as a kind of magic word, right? So I have colleagues who will say, if there's some dispute and they say, well, I think this is a social justice issue. And that means end of discussion. My view is correct. That's it, right? It's a social justice issue, period, right? To me, like if a social justice issue is one kind of moral issue, right? That doesn't end the debate. It clarifies the kind of thing we're talking about. And I do think a lot of times the way people are using social justice, and this is why people don't like the term, it's, the advocates for social justice a lot of times don't seem to care about ordinary justice, right? Whatever transforms the world, no matter, who it's, if that means slaughtering people and so on. That's been the case with left-wing communist regimes and stuff like that. We're pursuing social justice. So social justice becomes something completely different from ordinary justice. The way I would think of it, though, is just that it's not something completely different from ordinary justice, or the rules suddenly don't apply if you're talking about inequality or something. But ordinary justice, ordinary morality has to do with the decisions we make as individuals. But part of that ends up being, how do we design societies? And so and part of what, we can talk about more is how much can society be designed, but it's not that we can certainly we can alter the institutions in some ways, and we have, right? So people have been trying to alter the world, the social world, for the better for a long time. I don't think we should stop that pursuit, right? As long as it is grounded in reality and in our own morality. People won't agree on social justice, on what constitutes it, but I think most people actually do agree that we want to try to make a better social world. So that's all that it's about. How can we think better about it? So I think on the one hand, that could mean for people who don't like the term and don't want to do those pursuits, you could be thinking better about social justice. Oh, actually, is social justice something we should be pursuing? For people who like the term a lot and see themselves as activists, it's more how can we think better about it in terms of, and this is mostly the focus of the book, what are some errors you're making in thinking about social justice? If we were actually to take a social science perspective, are there things that could inform our social justice discussions?
I took some questions on X. Jerry Z. Mueller asked, have you ever read or taught Hayek's The Mirage of Social Justice?
I am somewhat familiar with Hayek's take on social justice, and I think I quoted something from him either in this book or in The Rise of Victimhood Culture when we wrote that. But I don't I don't know about the full argument. So I guess
I got a lot of Hayek related questions. Yeah. I posed that one.
I think the general idea that people use social justice in a way that is often about power or whatever they're pursuing rather than actually making much sense or performing the world. I think I would agree with those criticisms. It's just again a matter of whether we need to abandon the word. I don't care as much about words, but it's the term people use, so that's what I'm trying to use.
Right. Also on X, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Jukka Savolainen said, seen as justice refers to social arrangements like outcomes and opportunities between people. What is the analytic value of adding the word social before the word justice? Aren't property rights just the same as human rights?
Yeah. So I think that social justice, in the way that I would think of it, is an aspect of justice. So in a sense, it's not adding anything. It's not like it's a new kind of justice. But I think that in terms of just distinctions that we would make in kind of what kind of justice issue are we talking about, it can be clarifying. I agree that the way people use it, it's not. So for example, what I would think of in terms of clarifying social justice issues is to think about what arrangements are like and the consequences they have. Okay, so the thing about moral issues is that a lot of times people talk about them. There are all these dilemmas philosophers like to pose and things like that. Don't usually have anything to do with the moral decisions people make. I do think there are moral difficulties and conundrums people encounter, but a huge part of morality, and in our lives is just knowing that they should do a particular thing and just not particularly wanting to do it, right? So if you think about something simple as like you're playing a game of cards with someone and you shouldn't cheat at that game, right? So it's that those are the kinds of things that I think of when I think of justice or fairness and those sorts of things. And we could think about it even in harm, right? So harm would be about not causing the suffering of others for no reason, all those sorts of things, and making those choices in your life. Now, in terms of how institutions are organized, how we do things collectively, there are all kinds of things that are not what anybody would think of as wrong in themselves that could have certain kinds of consequences. I gave an example of looking at if you were trying to reduce something like police violence, and this is an example. Peter Moskos had given, the criminologist. He showed that there were differences in the rates of police force in different cities, right? So cities with certain similar levels of crime. I mean, you could sort these out and see what all is different about them. But if some departments are killing people a lot more than others, right? You may look into things like what's the training like? What kinds of things could be done to reduce that level of violence? Now, from an ordinary justice perspective, if we went and looked at those killings and say the department where there were more killings by police, it may be that every one of those killings was, or the same proportion or whatever, right? They could be justified in a sense that somebody was doing something wrong. The law allows force in this situation and those kinds of things, right? But if we find that there are different kinds of police training practices or something that will lead in one sense in one department to fewer people being killed, even if those the excess killings, say, were justified on an individual level, we might say morally we should still do that, right? We should that and I think of that kind of thing as social justice, right? Somebody doesn't have to have behaved unjustly at an individual level. Again, like if every police killing that we're talking about is justified in somebody, behaving in some way, but there are ways that you can learn, or something that reduce those killings, and we value human life. I mean, there's trade-offs in terms of those situations, but we would like fewer people killed overall, and we think that's a moral good. Then you could say that we then have an obligation to implement those practices we know would save lives. But it doesn't, I mean, to me, that's a different kind of thing. It's not a completely different kind of thing, but it's a distinction that you can make within the broader idea of justice, of doing something at the collective level that will better the world in a sense, even though it's not really about reducing individual bad behavior, right, or individual motives and those kinds of things. Other kinds of things. I mean, I mentioned different possibilities. I've always been interested in what we call our advisor Donald Black called opportunity theories that explain human behavior with the distribution of what is possible. Is that how the definition ended up being? So the idea that with crime, you might be looking at things that make crime easier or more possible in a situation. And there have been all kinds of interesting findings with this, like, laws that mandate motorcycle helmets lead to fewer motorcycle thefts, right? Because, people usually steal motorcycles to go joyriding. They can't get away with that if they have to be wearing a helmet, okay? Or you look at burglaries in certain neighborhoods, and you see that the design of the neighborhood may reduce the likelihood of burglary or facilitate it, right? So if there are dark alleyways and things that people can get out of, as opposed to neighborhoods that direct people kind of out front of buildings in the light. And so that's an example too, where if we're designing a neighborhood and we know that a certain way of designing it would improve safety, lead to less burglary, things like that, you might say we have a moral obligation to do that, even though we don't normally think of something as, of designing a neighborhood a certain way as morally wrong. We're again not talking about individual morality. We're talking about our collective ability to make things better. That's why I think it's useful distinction. At least it makes sense to me. And I think even in terms of sorting those out, what should you be most passionate about, right, or angry with people about? It would be simply realizing that we have ways of making things better might be a cause to try to explain it to people. But for me, I think maybe moral outrage toward people who might disagree with you isn't always as appropriate, right? Because it's not like they're awful people who are cheating their neighbors and murdering people. It's just that people in a lot of times people just don't agree with what the consequences of certain behaviors or the best way we should be collectively trying to improve things are.
Yeah, I guess that kind of leads me into the subtitle of your book about why good sociology matters. I can think of this subtitle provoking two very opposite responses from different audiences. And to start with, a lot of my colleagues, and probably yours as well, take it for granted that sociology is about pursuing social justice. So, of course, if you're doing good sociology, you're doing good social justice. They're almost synonymous. And when I solicited a question about this interview on Blue Sky, which I actually have tried out, I got a response from Nick Lalone, who said, "Whose side are we on?" Which I think is a reference to that old Becker article arguing against value neutral sociology. So if you do value free sociology, aren't you shirking your ethical duties? Is there a positive moral case for doing it? And doesn't good sociology, by definition, pursue social justice?
Yeah. So why good sociology matters? So originally had subtitled it so how to think better about social justice, why good sociology matters. My original title was how to think better about social justice, and why bad sociology only makes things worse. And I do like the positive framing of the new title, but why bad sociology only makes things worse is actually in a way the same thing as why good sociology matters. Okay, so I'm saying that sociology can actually be beneficial for pursuing social justice, but I don't think that it always is in practice, right? So because there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of bad sociology, and that translates into bad pursuits of social justice, things that can harm the world. My book is framed in terms of how you might think about things, and it's less about the conclusions you might draw morally. I mean, I'm making suggestions, and a lot of it is based on maybe my moral values, but it's also the kinds of things people express as desirable. So there may seem to be a contradiction with a lot of people, because I support value-free sociology, as did Max Weber. And that's the old term, and I use it and I'm fine with it. Value neutral sociology, I think it could often be a better term in describing exactly what you're talking about. Because when you say value free, people seem to think you're saying that you're somehow uninfluenced by values, maybe, or that it's some kind of perfect, your work is perfectly objective, or something like that. And so the argument has never been from Max Weber or anybody that sociology could be value free in that sense. That the topics you choose to study might be influenced by your values. That doesn't mean necessarily it's the best way to choose your topics, but sometimes that's legitimate, and in all kinds of ways, you might be influenced for, and that could also even be distortions, right? Because people don't always do their work perfectly objectively. Value free means value neutral. It's just that sociology is not, as sociology, making value judgments about things. Sociologists who do that are making value judgments as individuals, as human beings, as something else, not as sociologists, even if they claim to be. I mean, you can assert moral values and call them sociology, but they are not scientific statements if science is describing and explaining the observable world. Okay, so a value judgment, a statement about what is right or wrong, is simply not a description or an explanation of the observable world. And I know you agree with me. And at some point, you just have, if people can't see that a value judgment can't be derived logically from facts about the world, or even this, that it's not the same thing as facts about the world, then it's hard to know what to do with that, right? You can kind of show that it doesn't make any sense. You can, I think Wittgenstein or somebody said if someone doesn't see a logical relationship, you can't make them see it, or something. And Donald Black, our advisor, had said you also can't make them see the lack of a relationship, right? Like that if they're determined to assert that a statement about how the world should be or what somebody should be doing is the same as a statement about what they are doing or something, or either they're the same or that the statement about what they are doing can somehow lead logically to the statement about what they should be doing. If that's what people think, at some point that's just not true. But I don't know, what else to say. So sociology, it's not just that sociology can be value-free, it's that it is. If your statements are not value-free statements, not value-neutral statements, they're not sociological statements. So a statement that the death penalty should be abolished, or that taxes should be lowered, or whatever it is, that those are not, or that people should be nice to one another, they're not sociological statements. They're value judgments about the world. Value judgments are important part of what we do as human beings, but they're not sociology. So if I'm saying sociology is value-free, but then I'm also saying, sociology can help us in our social justice pursuits, is that a contradiction? And it's not. It's just a distinction that's being made. And it's the same thing when Max Weber argued for value-free sociology. Max Weber, the German sociologist writing in the early 20th century, he argued that sociology could, in fact, provide clarity about moral questions. So it can't answer them, but it can clarify things, even helping us to clarify what the debates are about, but also saying that, if you take this action, this is likely to be the consequence, right? So that's the kind of thing that is, in principle, discoverable through social science, through other sciences, right? If you do this, these are the consequences. It doesn't tell you whether you should desire those consequences, whether they're the best consequences in terms of what the trade-offs would be, whether the action that you would take would be moral or immoral, right, to achieve those consequences. Those aren't the kinds of questions that you would answer. But social science, because by describing and explaining the world accurately, including the world of our moral debates, can help us to clarify those things. So when it comes to social justice questions, like in what ways should our social institutions be changed, what kinds of laws should be passed, and those kinds of things, sociology isn't going to answer those. And those who do, as I said, are not doing sociology when they do it. But it should be able to provide clarity. I mean, it will, so I say first, learn about the world before changing it, right? That's a strong principle. Sociology can also point to things like the fact that there are trade-offs. People assert different moral values, and most actions that people take will maybe be good if you've stipulated that a certain kind of thing is good in one way and bad in another, right? Because people have these different things they're trying to achieve. So it points that there are trade-offs in most decisions. I think sociology, another thing it shows us is that we can't have a perfect world. So the pursuit of perfection is something that's often been disastrous. So anyway, so I think that's how value-free science relates to social justice. It actually needs to be value-free, so that we can clarify these kinds of things and describe and explain the world. And then we can have moral debates about it, right? And it should clarify those. And I think that sociology that is not value-free actually has been disastrous in many ways, or can be disastrous if it's implemented, right? The ideas. I think Marxism is an obvious example. And I think somebody said I shouldn't talk about Marxism so much because nobody believes it anymore or something, but it's something like 25% of sociologists identify as Marxists. So yeah,
like that, yeah.
I get it. It's been discredited, but not everybody is on board with that. And because to audiences other than people who embrace Marxism would be more likely to see the bad consequences of Marxism, I think it's a good way to, if you're for people who are on the left and are sympathetic to the idea that capitalism produces vastly too much inequality, those sorts of things. But then they also have seen the disasters of Marxism in terms of not just not just the material standards and the lack of prosperity and those kinds of things, but also just the human rights violations and even the inequality that remains and so on. I think that what I'm trying to do is to just to show that just because you have a critique of a certain problem doesn't mean that your answer is good, right? And to show that, no, in fact, people do pursue social justice in ways that are disastrous and have bad effects, often even from their own perspective. Okay, so even from their own moral perspective. And so when I look at contemporary sociology or contemporary social justice debates, where you've taken a kind of Marxist framework with critical theory and the kind of popularizing of it that people now have started calling wokeism, aligning with what we called victimhood culture ideas. But those ideas are not Marxist, but they take a similar kind of Marxist framework about exploitation and oppression, and seeing it with multiple forms of identity-based oppressions rather than just something about class. But I think the problems that exist with Marxism exist with that perspective too, and that it's something that doesn't describe the world accurately and won't therefore help to change the world for the better.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there might be two opposite reactions to that subtitle, and you addressed the first one. Isn't sociology grand because we already do social justice? But I think the other reaction you would get from a lot of people outside sociology who have a low opinion of the field, including people in other branches of social science, would be, there's good sociology? Where is this good sociology? Isn't it all ideological tripe? Isn't it all critical theories?
Yeah, so a lot of what I've tried to do is to point to what I think is some of the more scientific approaches within sociology, kind of to highlight those. And I talk about critical theory, and it's not even just critical theory. I discuss a lot that perspective because it informs so many social justice pursuits. And I think, when I talk about these errors in pursuing social justice, I think what I see in a lot of social justice activism that is influenced by critical theory, it tends to make these kinds of errors, right? Which is like, first of all, like, learn about the world before you change it. They're kind of going forward with, first of all, with the idea that they know how things work. And, I said to draw from different perspectives, that it's like part of the reason I wrote this and previous stuff I've written about this is that even if critical theory is a better perspective than I think within sociology, it's still one competing theoretical perspective. And so it was I think kind of weird at first to see in the broader society, people suddenly start accepting these things as if they were some obvious truth. People outside sociology, corporate trainings, all these kinds of things, which and a lot of these things were controversial within sociology, and so I talk about different perspectives you draw from. I talk about whether critical theory is less a scientific perspective and is it more of an ideology. So I talk about the need to avoid ideology in pursuing social justice, trying to it's better to treat ideological claims through scientific scrutiny. I mean, the way I phrase it is, don't treat ideology as science, but I mean, don't treat it as if an ideological statement, as if it's been subject to the kind of testing and debate and stuff that science has. But I would say, in a way, treat ideology as science. Like, take a statement and see if it corresponds to reality. See if this is true, what would things look like, and try to devise those tests and those kinds of explanations. So I talk about scientific thinking that way, and how, avoiding that kind of ideological thinking would make more sense. I talk about the error that I've kind of mentioned before of kind of acting as if there aren't trade-offs to our policies, and we don't have to balance those different kinds of things. This is what Weber called, the warring gods, right? That we always have these different kinds of values conflicting. I talk about pluralism, and I think a lot of social justice pursuits act as if nobody's ever going to disagree with them. And I think what liberalism does, liberal democracy, is it's criticized by activists who don't like the kinds of institutions, free speech, due process, all these sorts of things that actually are about kind of managing imperfections, right? And accepting that everybody's not going to agree with you, society's not going to be perfect, and these kinds of things, unless you plan to somehow get rid of the people who disagree with you, as the totalitarian states have tried. You're going to have to manage that disagreement. That should be thought of as something that is social justice itself. Right? How do we form a society where people disagree about fundamental aspects of morality, not where we somehow get rid of the people who are wrong or change their minds or something. And then just realizing, as I said before, there's no there's no perfect society. I think, again, sociology, in examining how societies work, can show us that, how morality works. So good sociology, scientific sociology, can help us in our thinking about the world. And so, yeah, to the question, is there any good sociology that people might who are often in agreement with us about things and might be very critical about our field? I see why they're critical, particularly about the ideological sociology. But I've been influenced by scientific thinking, and a lot of this has been by Donald Black, who was each of our for both of us, our advisor and dissertation chair, and he died early this year, and I thought was one of the most significant sociological theorists ever. I mostly drawn from Black's work and Black's framework in my work. I'm not in this book arguing even that we should use Donald Black's framework for things. I'm thinking more of scientific sociology more generally. That includes Donald Black and what he calls pure sociology. It includes a lot of what's been called rational choice theory, exchange theory type stuff. It includes network analysis and in particular theorists. I think Randall Collins is probably, I think, the most significant living sociological theorist, and I would point to him as somebody whose work is grounded in trying to understand how the social world works. So I could go through all these different kinds of perspectives that I've been influenced by, even some of them that I haven't used in my work. But in this book, and How to Think Better About Social Justice, it is kind of more broadly about sociology in that sense, where I think I point to some of the findings, but more just to how scientific sociologists in general want to think about understanding the social world and how that differs from the more ideological perspectives. And my argument is, if you actually care about social justice, the scientific perspectives will help you more than the people who are forefronting the social justice, because science is a better way of understanding the world than activism is.
Yeah, and in your book, you go through some of these examples of other perspectives other than neo-Marxian conflict theory that are in the field that you can, and you talk about how you could use those to try to achieve a more beneficial outcome in society. Like you've already mentioned a couple, like reducing crime rates by changing opportunities or increasing opportunities to do virtuous things is another way you put it. And which leads me and maybe someone else reading your book to ask, are you aware of any concrete example of applied sociology working?
I think there are a lot, but I think they are probably then taken for granted and not thought of as a great insight anymore, or they're at a kind of small level. Some of the stuff I was talking about with opportunity theory and crime, I don't know to what extent businesses and stuff have implemented some of these things. I know there was a study of, I think, 7-Elevens and looking at how the design layout of the store would reduce crime. So, to the extent, I suppose that those doing those kinds of studies and stuff, they may have been implemented. I think, there's lots of ways that, and by working doesn't even necessarily mean from a social justice standpoint. It could just be from a business making money standpoint. And I think, the layouts of stores and things like that have often been designed to increase purchases and things like this. They must have done some sort of testing and that. So that's applied sociology. I think it's not something necessarily where you're starting from a grand theory, but you're seeing how the world works making little changes to make it work in the way that you want it to. So I think that's done all the time. I mean, isn't what public policy? I mean, I think a lot of public policies don't work, but some of them do. So I mean, I feel like people are constantly manipulating the world in ways that are derived from our knowledge of the world, and sometimes they get things wrong. A lot of time, maybe more than not. But so I think people may have in mind more is something coming from the discipline, the official discipline of sociology or something, right? Rather than just the broad sense of being of knowledge about the social world being used to effectively change the world. No, I think things are certainly probably good examples from network theory and those sorts of things. But I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't think about my own answers until I asked that question, which I just came up with. But I do know network theory for sure, because I know Christakis does that kind of stuff with health interventions.
Yeah.
And looking at how you use the friendship paradox to have more cost-effective health interventions. I also was thinking about what you said at the beginning of your comment that a lot of stuff's just not considered applied sociology, even though it probably would be. Or like we use the term social technology a lot. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that a lot of things that you might think of as social technology probably just get taken for granted as culture or standard operating procedure. Like at some point, some king had to invent making your army drill so they'd be better on the battlefield. And that just becomes what you do, but someone had to invent that.
Yeah, and the operating of organizations and things like that. Once it becomes standard knowledge or practices, it's then not not thought of as a new discovery. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't think that that sociology as a discipline has done a ton of good stuff, but I think partly is that to the extent that it has succeeded as a science, it's been able to do that. But I think that's been a challenge. And in terms of making things worse, so if the knowledge derived from sociology can make things worse, and it could make things better. So even with critical theory, I mean, I think this is part of my criticism of this. I actually would ask the question of that as any of the interventions derived from this perspective that are consistent with it had been shown to be helpful, or even the ideas. So I think so. There's certainly evidence about diversity trainings that are derived from this perspective, and this is something Musa Al-Gharbi has talked about. The sociologist Musa Al-Gharbi, his new book is We've Never Been Woke, and it's been getting a lot of attention. It's very good, and I recommend it. I would have certain quibbles, but he's written about the fact that what the result of diversity training, critical theory type diversity training that teaches you that whites are the oppressors of people of color and all these sorts of things. And wants people to think about their privileges or think about their victimhood. The outcome of it isn't that it makes people more empathetic toward the poor, say, right? So people who are disadvantaged. It just makes them more hostile to the white working class, right? To whites who are disadvantaged. So is that the so I mean his interpretation is always that these things are actually things that are working to the advantage of the class that is encouraging them, the symbolic capitalists. So that this workers in symbols and stuff. So yes, it's very convenient for them that the only effect it has is to direct more hostility toward white people who are not them. But if you're actually like trying to reduce inequality, it seems to have the opposite effect. And there's lots of examples like that. I mean, that was the thing that Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt were first arguing. The book that later became the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. First, it was an Atlantic article. A key thing in the book, but also the main thing I think in the Atlantic article, was that the ideas that these critical theory type ideas, these new ideas about social justice, about microaggressions and trigger warnings and safe spaces and all these kinds of things, were actually going against the recommendations that would come from cognitive behavioral therapy. And so actually producing depression and anxiety in the people that they were supposedly helping. Okay. So I think all those kinds of things where we can see things not working, I'm arguing that actual studies and stuff are demonstrating this, right? So if we get rid of those diversity training programs because we've found this out, because we've criticized this theory and said that there's a better framework for understanding, that would be an example of improving things through sociological knowledge. Again, it's not the bad sociological knowledge; it's the criticism of it. And I think some of that is happening. People are dropping some of those programs, and I think they sometimes doing that because they're showing that the outcomes aren't what were promised. So I don't want to sound too optimistic about the ability of sociology to improve things. It's just that I don't know how else you would go about improving things other than trying to carefully learn about the social world. And if the institutionalized discipline of sociology is so far gone that it can't do that anymore, then fine, maybe that needs to be gotten rid of. But I'm talking about sociology as the science of social life, the science of social reality. And again, I don't know what else would help us to improve things.
Ryan Shaw, handle that Shaw guy. Big shout out to Ryan. He's one of our subscribers here on Bullfish Hole. He asks, how do we achieve a balance in thinking about these types of concerns within various systems like academia, government, and companies? Is there a way to avoid periodic secular Great Awakenings, or is this just part of the natural cycle of modern societies?
And that's, so the argument of Musa's book, Musa Al-Gharbi's book, We Have Never Been Woke, is that there have been these multiple awakenings. So people have called the kind of move in the last 10 years or so toward this kind of critical theory informed social justice, the Great Awakening. And Al-Gharbi is saying that there are comparable things, right, throughout history. So are there ways to avoid it? So my How to Think Better About Social Justice book, it's different from some things because it talks about sociology a lot, but it isn't itself a sociological theory, right, or something like that. So this book is not a theory of social justice movements or something. I think I probably refer to some of those theories. This is about how we think about social justice and how we incorporate insights into that and the errors that sociologists are making right now. I think it's useful to think of the logic of certain positions as one thing, and then why people hold those positions as another, right? The explanation of it. And I'm interested in both of those things. And what we did in the rise of victimhood culture was to try to explain the movement. And so I think from that standpoint, if you're trying to prevent it, you're up against a lot, right? Like it's just interesting to me. I think you see moments of history or certain kind of historical events where oppression and victimhood is just literally what you see, right? Like some group goes and conquers another and enslaves them. Okay, so it's kind of odd that in a kind of world where we have so much less of that's the kind of society you want to then describe in an oppression and victimhood framework. Okay, so it's like people talking to each other is really in some sense just like the Roman army coming in and conquering people. It's degree or something, and I think that, like, again, I think that's a fundamentally wrong framework and hasn't been good in helping us pursue social justice. But the social dynamics or the sociology of its existence is that you actually, in a society where there is that kind of direct oppression, that's a society where, yes, people rise up and there are different kinds of movements and stuff, but the dominant morality in a society where there are those kinds of conquerors and stuff is one that not just accepts inequality, but sees it as fundamentally good. And one of the worst things that can happen in the society is for people to not obey their superiors, right? Like that. That's the morality of that society. So as we've made, what I would think of as improvements, that's a more moral thing, but as we've created a kind of society that's based less on that, right? That's based on free exchanges between people in the marketplace, that's tried to protect individual rights in various kinds of ways, that now we see it as immoral to go conquering other countries, or that it still happens, but less often, and we look down on it. I mean, this is the kind of society where once things have improved, it becomes an effective criticism to make, to call somebody an oppressor, to call them to point to the inequalities that do exist and things like this. Whereas in a society where there's a drastically much more inequality, that kind of insult doesn't sting, right? Like nobody cares that they're said to be exploiting somebody. Of course, we're exploiting them or something. So yeah, I just don't think that, and this is where I get to like my argument has been that a perfect society isn't possible. I don't think you're going to have a society where there aren't these constant tensions between how much inequality we should accept, for example, right? And to some extent, it's been present through human existence. I mean, I in a lot of ways, and I talk about it in the book, and we've talked about it before, but Jonathan Haidt's idea of the different dimensions of morality, and in his newer framework, he has one of those dimensions as liberty oppression, and there's also the one that's always been there, authority subversion. And so the liberty oppression thing is all about, don't dominate me. The authority subversion thing is about don't disobey your rightful rulers, right? Those are in tension with each other, right? Those are fundamental aspects of human morality, and they're always in tension. And it gets into these ideas of whether rule is legitimate or something, whether inequality is legitimate. Those are all moral disputes, and they're not going away. So if you think of wokeism and similar things as being one aspect of that, like arguing that certain kinds of inequality are oppression. Okay, so I don't know that you eliminated, or that it, I don't even know that it's not a good thing to have some of that as a pushback against things, right? Like more views in the mix. I think it's become dominant in a lot of institutions without a larger buy-in from the society, though, and I think that may be reversing in certain places, not in academia as far as I can see, but in corporations and stuff maybe. So I know a lot of people have already declared that the Great Awakening's over. It's and I don't see that, but I do think So how can you avoid it? I mean, some of it is just the ordinary mechanisms that you would use to prevent fringe views or even minority moral views from dominating institutions in a democratic society. I mean, is there any? Okay, so we don't think we should have our public universities teaching Islam, for example, right, or right as the truth. But we don't even think it should be teaching Christianity or even belief in God or some kind of dominant religious belief. I don't know what's the dominant religious belief in our currently very pluralistic society, but it's probably but it's certainly some form of Christianity, right? Like even if it's very thin or something. But we don't dedicate our public institutions to that. So we're certainly not. I certainly don't see why our public institutions would need to be dedicated to some fringe idea or even minority idea about social justice. And to the extent that that's happened and these institutions have been captured, I think people push back on it. And I think that those ordinary processes are a way to prevent it, right? What is the Great Awakening? It wasn't just suddenly a huge majority of the American population bought into critical theory ideas, right? It was that they became dominant in particular places, and all these dynamics of making sure people don't push back and things like that happened. I mean, a lot of these things, there's no magic way from sociology to oppose things. It's just that you just oppose them, right? Like I think that's what you do if you see these values as wrong and having bad effects, you say that. And there's certainly, I mean, I don't think it's sociologically unrealistic to think that has some effect.
Speaking of being sociologically realistic, and you mentioned in your answer that we've always had inequality with us, or tensions between equality and inequality. In your book, you talk about utopian communities. I found that section very interesting. What can utopian communities teach us about social justice?
I think these utopian communities from the 19th century America are very fascinating. It was a time. I mean, just the whole time period is fascinating in some ways. Like you have, in some ways, very traditional, very conservative society by later standards, but then you also have these fringe groups going and setting up like a free love community here, or a abolish private property community, or this and that. And so they were experimenting with a lot of different things. So it's interesting about a world. I mean, people got persecuted sometimes, so it wasn't like. But I mean, in historical terms, it was a time period that was in some ways there were very traditional societies, but people were also able in the United States, because of frontiers and things like that, I guess, to break away and to form these communities. So that's in the chapter about imperfection and utopia. And so, as I said before, I mean, we can't create a perfect society. And so, to pursue a utopia, it's a sociologically impossible thing, right? You can't have a perfect society. The idea of utopia is interesting anyway, in terms of should we have it as an ideal? Because I think in a lot of times we might think, oh, we need these ideals even if we can't fully realize them, and so. Should we have a conception of the perfect society that we should be pursuing, even if we don't get there? And the reason I don't think, or at least that we should question that, is that the actual pursuit of utopia has so often led to disaster, right? Because it's very easy, if you think you can create a perfect society once and for all, to see the trade-offs. Again, there's always trade-offs as justified no matter what, right? So. I talk about Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, who was a Marxist, being asked, "Well, was it okay that the Soviet Union killed tens of millions of people?" And he said, "No, the communist society wasn't actually realized." And the interviewer said, "Well, what if it had been? What if it brought about this utopia?" And he said, "Well, then it would have been." But you see that mindset where, well, you kill a few, tens of millions of people because we will have a perfect society. Well, you'll never have a perfect society, so that calculus is off then. So I talked about that kind of view as, if we're thinking about utopian pursuits, you have on one hand like the Armageddon option, where it's like we're going to drastically transform the society, we're going to have war, we're doing all those things. So in comparison with that, I love these 19th century utopian communities because they're not going to war with people. They just like go set up their communities, and the belief was that they would be so good and so successful that they wouldn't have to go slaughter people. Everybody would imitate them, and it would be great. I call that the field of dreams option, because it's like if you build it, it will come, right? So they'll flock to it because it'll be great. It's still an interesting example of in a lot of cases people thinking they could create a perfect society, and let's see what happens when they do. And I think sometimes, I mean, this is one thing I've argued too in terms of how people end up thinking about ordinary morality, about liberal democracy, about inequality, everything, is people will see some problem in the world, and assuming that can be simply solved, right, rather than improved or something, or maybe we even already have the right balance of things. If you understand that the world is a world of trade-offs, simply seeing problems doesn't mean that there's a good solution to that. But I think people who are utopian-minded, they'll see, for example, that, there's lots of problems in marriages and lots of conflict over sex, right? So one strategy is like, we just get rid of marriage, right? That was and sex, So that was the Shakers, right? So we're a religious community that banned sex and marriage, right? That was out. And then you have like the Oneida community, which was a free love community, right? So it's the opposite way. It's abolishing marriage too, but to have free love rather than no sex. And both of them are reactions, one way or the other, to the idea of monogamy, right? But it could be that marriage, in the way that it was already practiced, or at least the ideal of it, right, that will people will pair up and you'll have monogamous relationships. It could be that is already a way of balancing a lot of the problems that come with conflict over sex and sexuality. And actually usually these utopian communities, if they last, a lot of times like the Oneida community ended up abandoning free love, right? Or they abolish private property and they're all going to live communally, and then later they separate and make sure each has a plot of land or something, right? So a lot of times they just go back to the default of the larger society. And I think that's the error that people are making a lot of times, is saying like, oh, there was this problem. There's a conflict over property. We'll get rid of property. Conflict over sex. We get rid of marriage. I mean, maybe the society already had a good balance of things, but maybe not. So that's why I think like it's a relatively harmless way to try things out. Not necessarily harmless for the people in the community, but at least it doesn't have the same effects on the larger society as people who've decided they have the way of remaking society and drastically transforming it at once. So these utopian communities, like, if they're successful and it actually works like they think, that everybody will copy them, that's fine. And if it doesn't work out, then it doesn't cause as much damage. So I kind of have like warm feelings for the utopians, and also because they put into practice, they're so confident of their ideas, they go try to live that way, right? How many of these critical theory informed social justice people are setting up communities, or even in the institutions they run? Do people see those as, I mean, if they were creating environments that looked really harmonious and looked like a great place to be, I think it would be different, right? But a lot of times they're not even trying, right? They're and this is, I think, the Musa al-Gharbi criticism of it, that they are simply elites who are reinforcing their elite status. They're not people who are trying to create an equal world. But so the 19th century communities are interesting, and my favorite, I think, was the Cabetists. Cabet was the French author, and so he wrote this book, Voyage to Ikaria, talking about this perfect kind of society. So he laid it out in the book. It's a fiction book. He had a following, and people, thought it was great. And then they went to Texas. That didn't work out. They ended up going to Illinois, in Nauvoo, than the Mormon community before, and setting up a community there. So it's, first of all, interesting to me. It's like that he writes a fiction novel about a utopian society. He creates a following. These people are so committed, they go to America, right? Like
really hardcore Trekkies.
Yeah, to set up this community. Yeah, we have that, exactly that kind of thing. And then they get into conflict. So Cabet is running the community. There start to be conflicts. So he starts asserting more control and taking more power. And then there forms a faction that are against him, and then there are a faction of loyalists who support him. And so you've got people in the utopian community now divided over whether they support the founder. They end up kicking him out. So Cabet and his and the people who are loyal to him then they have to go found their own community somewhere else. The people that stay there, this is what's fascinating to me too. They stay there. They're still dedicated to his ideas. They've just kicked him out and deposed him, right? But we're still trying to implement his ideas. We read his works every night and that kind of thing. And my argument is just that we can understand sociologically why people have conflicts in these communities. And I draw from Donald Black's theories of conflict, and what conflicts are about. It's changes in status, for example, when Cabet tried to assert more authority, right, over the community. This was a change in the status relations. This produces conflict. We could look at all kinds of other things too. Once the factions start splitting, they're eating together and separate. So that's an increase in relational, what Black calls relational distance, or it's a reduction in intimacy. All those things cause conflict, and there's always going to be conflict in a society because there are always those kinds of changes going on. Intimacy fluctuates. Status fluctuates, diversity. So those fundamental variables change, and those changes cause conflict. So you can't get a perfect society because you can't stop change in that sense, right? Stop social change. So those communities are interesting because they follow just the patterns of ordinary communities, or there's nothing utopian about them. but they often don't seem like horrible places to live either, right? Sometimes they, again, it kind of varies how oppressive they are themselves. And then you see this pattern that the Icarians, following Cabet, the ones who stayed there, that was an example where they were trying communal living. That didn't work, so they end up, dividing up and having their own like plots or something. Again, kind of reverting to the norms of the broader society, right? Presumably because those norms work better, right? The changes they tried to make, and it's a good way of experimenting, right? And to some extent, they should be credited, for abandoning what didn't work. The problem was really their utopianism, this idea that they were actually going to create not just what might be a better world for them, a better community, but some kind of perfect world that everybody would flock to, and it would be the way societies would now be organized. But I would if there's some way for people who are completely dissatisfied with the mainstream society and our norms and our institutions, rather than becoming revolutionaries, if they could, or even, I guess most of these people aren't real revolutionaries, right? They're pretend revolutionaries. But even rather than being pretend revolutionaries who advocate revolution in front of their classes, if they could go set up communities, right? Go live the way they say people should live. That would be something that would, if nothing else, provide some good sociological data for the different possibilities, and we can test those out and see what happens.
So please, yes, I encourage all listeners to go found a utopian community somewhere. Two last little questions. These are more personal questions. I don't know if my audience has any interest in them. But one, you talk about the techniques for neutralizing disagreement. Is that a Sykes and Matza reference?
Maybe. Why did I use that term? No, I mean, I may have been, been influenced by that language a bit, because there it's like about neutralizing your own moral opposition to something to carry it out. And I was just, what I was trying to think of, so that's in the pluralism chapter, where, in terms of these different principles, and I say, one principle has to be to account for pluralism, right? Account for differences, account for disagreement, right? People are going to disagree with you about policies. There's some policies that can't be implemented if they won't be successful if there's too much disagreement, right? So I think understanding the level of disagreement in a society, which is itself that's a sociological question, it's an empirical question. One of the reasons I mention this as a way we should think better about social justice is I get the sense that a lot of people, in thinking about like public policy and things like that, think that there's abstractly some, like, can be a law that's a good law or something, and then it should be passed come what may because it's a good law, right? And I just, that doesn't describe the way I see the world working, right? There are different kinds of societies with different kinds of laws, and part of whether something is good or not does have to do with whether people agree with you, right? I think you can't discount the opinions of others in when you're making public policy. It's not, it really acts like they really act sometimes like, it's like, say it's gun control, okay? And say the society would be better off if we had very strict gun control, or we didn't have guns allowed like many other countries. I mean, I think it's actually true there would be less violence, right? But if that were the case, but in the society we live in, that involves confiscating people's guns, right? And if there's too much opposition to that, and I think that's probably true, right? Then it's not necessarily a good policy just because it might be a good policy in another country. You have to account for the level of disagreement. If people disagree with you and you can't accommodate that, then there has to be a way of neutralizing that disagreement. And I think I was trying to find a term that would encompass these different kinds of ways of doing that at the extreme, murdering people, right? Which is what, a lot of revolutionaries have done. And then I talk about incivility, just thinking of it as an example of trying to shame people into agreeing with you. And so I think that's what a lot of contemporary incivility is about in politics, where people are, on social media, Twitter or whatever, calling people all these awful things, and or even in the politics, and Trump and different kinds of things. There's a lot of incivility in current politics, and I think that could be a way of trying to shame people, quiet them, or something. It certainly doesn't seem to be respecting pluralism and agreement, and then also trying to indoctrinate people. And I think that's a lot of what happens in diversity training programs and at universities and stuff like that. And those are ways you might neutralize disagreement. And sometimes, you have to, persuading people isn't a bad thing. It's just sometimes impossible. So I think that's why we'd want to accommodate it. But yeah, I don't quite remember if I had Sykes and Matza in mind with the word neutralization. I was just thinking of it, but yeah, it means the same thing. So.
And my other question was that when you're going through the different sociological approaches that one could use and to pursue social justice, they map pretty well onto the eightfold scheme for classifying paradigms that we both learned from Donald Black in grad school. Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, why not all 8?
So I like, so part of it is that a lot of people have a way of classifying sociological theory that's very similar to Black's. So I don't, I think I actually like Black's the best. And I took his contemporary theory class as you did, a different semester than I did. But Donald Black's contemporary theory class was built around these 8 sociological paradigms, we call a strategy of explanation. So some of them are what people typically hear, like functionalist theory, or which he called systems theory, explaining human behavior with its contribution to the needs of a social whole, or conflict theory, explaining human behavior as a struggle for domination, or opportunity theory, explaining with what is possible, phenomenological theory, explaining human behavior with a person's subjective experience. But then some of them, or at least motivational theory, I think is the one of the interesting ones that doesn't align with what I've ever seen in any other system of classification. So what Black calls motivational theory, he defines it as explaining human behavior with psychological impact of social forces. Explaining human behavior with the psychological impact of social forces. So this is the idea: you have society in some sense, whether that is, and it could be socialization processes, it could be your environment in the immediate situation. He goes through different types of motivational theory too. But the idea is that there's something outside of the individual shaping the individual in this way, right? And this is something that never gets talked about as a type of theory. And I think Black is exactly right in identifying it. And I've wondered if it might even be the dominant perspective in sociology. Supposedly there's not a dominant theory, because people say, oh, there's conflict theory, there's functionalist theory, there's phenomenology. But across a lot of these people, people talk about Durkheim as a functionalist, and he had some functionalist analysis of crime and stuff and thought about society as being like an organism. But a lot of his analysis is what Black calls motivational. It's like looking at social forces and seeing how they shape people. And I think a lot of that, traditionally in sociology, that's been a lot of the discussion about the relation of the society to the individual, right? How much are we individuals? How much are we social? How does the social influence our behavior? So I thought it's very important to point to that because it's different from other theories, which is why I use Black's framework, just also because it's very clear, right? I didn't want the way I presented it to be too different from what you might see in other, except for the inclusion of motivational theories, to be too kind of distracting, as if the argument was based on this particular way of classifying theories. Because the argument in the chapter is just, there's no dominant paradigm in sociology. It hasn't normally seemed to be. They're not only different theories of things, but different kinds of theory. And I don't see why social justice ideas should just be based on conflict theory or one type of conflict theory we call critical theory. And so I tried to go through how might you think about social justice if you were doing motivational theory or opportunity theory, and giving examples of that. And I think so. The ones I didn't include in the discussion, I put in the footnote, but are probably or were pure sociology, Black's framework, and what Black calls neo-Darwinian theory, and I think I included the others. But I think it takes a lot of explaining, the chapters are short. Because pure sociology is Black's framework, and he invented it, and so you have to show that and show how it corresponds to the other things. And in other chapters, I talk about how Black's theoretical ideas could be applied to things. So it definitely is valuable as a framework for social justice. Also, Black had already in sociological justice, Black had and other kinds of work like that, he had talked a lot about how this approach specifically could be used to develop social technologies to change the world. And I didn't want to just repeat that. And part of it was to have a shorter, more succinct chapter that didn't get bogged down into sociological debates about how we should classify theories, because most of the theories I list there, most people who study theory would be familiar with the framework, because I cite other people, like sociological theory textbooks and stuff use a similar kind of framework, even though it doesn't have motivational theory, but functionalism, conflict, opportunity, or they'll have they usually just have more frameworks, right, that can be classified. So that's why I did that. And maybe I should have been more thorough and gone over every possible theory. I also didn't want it to, I didn't want it in that chapter to come across like I was arguing that the pure sociology, the framework that I used, that Donald Black invented, that I mostly use in my work. I didn't want the argument to be simply that people should be using that, because if I talk about that last, it looks like that's the culmination of it. And the argument was really more modest than that. It wasn't about what might be my particular critiques of sociological theory and the problems with things. It was more just saying there are a bunch of perspectives, at least address them, and don't just focus it so narrowly on critical theory. So it's trying to, like I said, there's a lot of sociological work that I might have certain criticisms of that I think and I think that work is still scientific and valuable, and it's trying to highlight that.
Right. Well, yeah, it's probably better off not to get bogged down in classifying different theories and meta-theoretical stuff that wasn't the point you were making. I thought that was probably why you did it, but I wanted to ask you. Well, I've eaten up over an hour and a half of your time, so I think I'm going to go ahead and bring this to a close. But I want to thank you for talking to me today.
Thanks. It's good to be on Bullfish Hole. My first time here.
And thanks to all my listeners. This has been the Bullfish Hole Podcast.